There are two graphics cards on the market today with a price tag of $250 US, the NVIDIA GeForce RTX 5050 and the Intel Arc B580. But which of these models is a better buy for entry-level gaming, particularly if you play games with upscaling enabled? That's what we'll be diving into in today's head-to-head benchmark. It's also a very tricky question to answer. Based on our day one reviews, you might think the answer is obvious because we were largely positive about the B580 and took a big old dump on the RTX 5050. But there's a lot more going on here today, with differences in upscaling quality, differences in driver polish, large swings in performance in either direction, and of course, the big difference in VRAM. The 5050 offers just 8GB, while the B580 gives you 12GB. How do all of these factors affect the comparison? Well, let's find out after this. This portion of the video has been sponsored by the AOC U27 G4XM, a fantastic 4K HDR mini LED gaming monitor. The 1152 zone backlight provides a high contrast experience with deep blacks and super bright highlights. It looks excellent in HDR games without any burn-in concerns. It's fast at 4K 160Hz and even clearer in its dual mode 320Hz configuration, offering a great balance for all types of gaming. And with a 4K resolution combined with decent factory calibration, this display doubles as a productivity monitor, making the U27 G4XM a single solution for many use cases. It's affordable for a 4K mini LED LCD, it's great value, we recommend it, so to learn more check out the AOC U27 G4XM via the links in the description below. As with previous videos in this series, the idea here is to provide a different set of data to our day one reviews, which largely focus on native performance at a range of resolutions. Native data is also included today, but the focus is the main upscaling modes like quality, balanced, and performance. Previously, we've done this testing at 1440p across a range of mid-range GPUs, but 1440p isn't necessarily what people are buying entry-level $250 cards for. 1080p is still quite popular in this class. I wasn't sure which way to go with this testing, so I polled you guys, the Hardware Unboxed community, about what resolution mainstream buyers use. The poll from a few weeks ago currently has 31,000 votes, and the most popular choice was 1080p with 55% of the vote. 1440p got 39%, so it's also quite a popular resolution these days, but 1080p remains king in the budget class, so it's what I've chosen for this video. Ideally, I would have liked to include both, but testing 4 or 5 upscaling modes at more than one resolution is far too time consuming for a single video. If there's interest though, I could revisit this topic at 1440p in future content. When comparing upscaling performance between the RTX 5050, which uses DLSS 4, and the Arc B580, which uses XeSS, we need to brush up on the visual differences between these technologies. We don't currently have a DLSS 4 versus XeSS comparison on the channel, so I'll quickly show some examples at 1080p so you can see how these compare. It's important to remember that while XeSS works across all modern GPUs, it uses a different version on Intel GPUs compared to non-Intel GPUs. Intel GPUs get access to a larger, higher quality upscaling model that uses Intel's exclusive XMX instructions. All other GPUs run the cut-down DP4A version, so if you've tried out XeSS on an NVIDIA or AMD GPU, that isn't representative of the quality you actually get on an Intel card. XeSS is also a little strange in that the render resolution used with each mode is different to DLSS 4 and FSR4. From XeSS 1.3 onwards, the quality mode, as an example, uses a 1.7 times scaling factor, whereas DLSS and FSR use a 1.5 times scaling factor in their quality modes. This means XeSS at a given mode renders at a lower resolution and performs more upscaling. The XeSS mode with an equivalent render resolution is always one notch higher, so ultra quality is a match for DLSS quality at a 1.5 times scale factor, XeSS quality matches DLSS balanced, and so on. For 1080p gaming, DLSS 4 delivers superior image quality most of the time. I've largely focused here on DLSS 4's quality mode versus XeSS quality and ultra quality. The most noticeable advantage DLSS 4 has is better sharpness and levels of blur. DLSS does a better job of eliminating temporal anti-aliasing blur in motion, giving games better overall clarity. In many situations, this makes games look like they are running at a higher resolution compared to XeSS running on an Intel GPU. At 1080p, I wouldn't say the level of clarity is amazing because all upscalers are weaker at lower output resolutions like this, but I certainly prefer the way DLSS looks. The other main advantages to DLSS are better fine detail reconstruction and better stability, so typically the presentation has better clarity, more detail, and fewer artifacts in motion. Sizzling, aliasing, and blurring can all still occur with DLSS, but you're more likely to notice these issues with XeSS. However, that's not to say XeSS is horrible. It's still a usable technology that's around the mark of previous versions of DLSS, like DLSS 3. To some degree, this makes sense, as the underlying AI model used in this upscaler has not been updated since early 2024, which was in the DLSS 3 era. XeSS is now at version 2.1, with XeSS 3 coming soon, but Intel's changelog only describes minor improvements to visual output since version 1.3, and that aligns with what I found testing both 1.3 and 2.0 versions in late 2025. What we're looking at with XeSS today is more of a previous generation upscaling technology, though DLSS 3-like output is still usable at higher modes, as of course DLSS 3 was a decent upscaler itself. I would also have the XMX version of XeSS falling short of what AMD's FSR4 offers at 1080p. FSR4 isn't quite as good as DLSS, especially at lower render resolutions, but it does a respectable job of handling detail and blur, exceeding the quality of DLSS 3. So if I had to make a tier list, DLSS 4 is in the top spot, FSR4 takes second place, third place, close battle between DLSS 3 and XeSS XMX. Below that would be the DP4A version of XeSS, and then comfortably in last place and basically unusable at 1080p is FSR 3. Now let's explore performance. For testing these GPUs, I'm using my standard Ryzen 7 9800X3D test rig to eliminate CPU bottlenecks, with about $1 million worth of memory, 32GB of DDR5 6000 CL30. The very latest game updates, Windows updates, and drivers have been used. As of putting this video together, that's the 581.94 hotfix driver for GeForce and driver 8250 from Intel. Let's get into it. Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart is first up, testing using the very high preset with ray tracing enabled. The RTX 5050 is not an especially powerful GPU in this configuration, falling short of a 60 FPS average unless we use balanced upscaling, so perhaps ray tracing is a bit much for this card. However, these settings are playable on the ARC B580, which delivers 60 FPS natively and over 70 FPS using XeSS upscaling. Natively, the B580 is 30% faster, and we also see a 28% margin when comparing upscaling at the same render resolution, so DLSS 4 quality versus XeSS ultra quality. Using the same named modes, quality versus quality, the Intel GPU is 34% faster. With this game and many in this comparison, it's also important to mention a few game-specific and GPU-specific issues. On the RTX 5050, VRAM is a concern, with this title using over 11GB in this configuration, which causes performance problems on the 5050's 8GB of VRAM. On the B580, enabling XeSS can cause performance issues until you restart the game, which is not the case when enabling DLSS on the GeForce card during gameplay. Spider-Man 2 running using maximum settings is a pretty terrible experience on both GPUs. Enabling DLSS 4 on the RTX 5050 actually causes performance to go backwards, with worse 1% lows. This configuration uses about 11GB of VRAM, which overwhelms the 5050's VRAM buffer, and this can't just be solved by enabling upscaling. The B580 suffers from a different issue, which is just poor performance overall. It can average around 40 FPS when upscaling is enabled, but frame time consistency is bad and the game is unpleasant to play. Scaling is poor on the B580 as well, with performance issues even dropping to medium settings. This is an example of what happens in some games when trying to run at ultra settings on an entry-level GPU, even at 1080p. In Assassin's Creed Shadows, I'm using the medium settings, which is the first preset that's playable on either GPU. Here the B580 is slower than the RTX 5050 by 5 to 6%, both natively and when using upscaling. Shadows does not expose the XeSS Ultra Quality mode, so the first possible upscaling setting is Quality, which even with a lower render resolution cannot match the performance of DLSS 4 quality on the 5050. Scaling is a little better on the GeForce card as well, with lower upscaling modes gaining more performance. Now, Assassin's Creed Shadows can exceed 8GB of VRAM quite easily on higher settings, but neither of these GPUs is powerful enough to utilize higher presets, though on the B580 you could probably use the medium preset and raise texture quality. As things stand though, the medium settings use less than 6GB of VRAM at 1080p, which is fine on both cards. The Last of Us Part 2 runs better on the R.T.X B580. Using the very high preset, the Intel GPU is 14% faster using native rendering, 12% faster using ultra quality versus quality upscaling, and 17% faster using quality versus quality. VRAM is a concern in this title. Usage can reach over 9GB at 1080p using the very high preset, which as you can see is a playable configuration performance-wise on the B580. The 5050 doesn't suffer too badly despite this VRAM usage in our benchmark pass, but could be problematic after longer periods of gameplay or in other areas. The R.T.X B580 is significantly faster in Ghost of Tsushima. Using native rendering and the very high preset, the B580 runs this game very well, achieving 82 FPS on average, 58% faster than the RTX 5050. It also holds a 52% lead when comparing ultra quality versus quality upscaling, so there is no doubting the B580 offers the best experience in this title. However, there are some caveats. The B580 has graphical glitches when opening the settings menu, which aren't present with the 5050, though after a restart of the game, this doesn't affect gameplay. VRAM is also not a concern in this title, with usage topping out at 7.7GB in our benchmark area, so the performance discrepancy seen here appears to be related to GPU performance itself. S.T.A.L.K.E.R 2 is one of the more interesting games in our test suite. Looking at the overall performance numbers, we see that the B580 is 39% faster using native rendering at 1080p with the Epic preset, but this margin drops to about even when quality upscaling is enabled. The NVIDIA GPU scales better using the lower modes like Balanced and Performance. The difference we see using native rendering is largely due to highly inconsistent performance on the RTX 5050 using the Epic preset. Frame time performance here is bad, and each time you load a save file, performance can be wildly different. This is because the Epic settings at 1080p are right on the edge with 8GB of VRAM, pushing up to around 8.4GB on the B580 in our test area. However, when you enable upscaling, VRAM usage drops to a little under 8GB, which is why the 5050 can claw back so much performance using DLSS 4. It's still right on the edge though, and it's possible in some areas of the game the Epic preset will overwhelm 8GB models even with upscaling enabled. Marvel Rivals is a clear example of VRAM issues using the Ultra preset at 1080p. While the RTX 5050 delivers higher average frame rates than the B580, 1% low performance is significantly worse with noticeable stuttering. This is because a section of the benchmark run slightly exceeds 8GB even with upscaling enabled. Now the B580 doesn't offer the greatest experience in this title despite avoiding VRAM concerns, only just averaging 60 FPS with ultra quality upscaling enabled, so you'll probably want to reduce the quality preset in this title either way. Star Wars Outlaws performance is a bit bizarre. DLSS 4 doesn't do a whole lot on the RTX 5050 at 1080p using the ultra preset, with the performance mode actually performing worse than the other options for some reason. On the B580, using lower quality modes seems to hit a 65 FPS wall at 1080p, though the quality mode is playable. Using native rendering, the B580 is 15% faster than the 5050, the same margin is seen comparing ultra quality versus quality upscaling, and this lead extends to a large 41% comparing quality versus quality. Again, VRAM seems to be a contributing factor to the 5050's issues in Outlaws, with the Ultra preset using up to 9GB. This game allocates a lot of VRAM, even on lower settings, and this can help load textures at further distances, so the B580 is the better card for this title. God of War Ragnarok average performance is roughly the same on the RTX 5050 and R.T.X B580. The ARC card has a small advantage when comparing quality versus quality upscaling, but if we keep the render resolution the same, the two cards are a match. However, 1% lows are superior on the B580, as the Ultra preset is right on the edge with 8GB of VRAM. The game gives you a VRAM warning on the 5050 in this configuration, but is highly playable from a GPU performance standpoint on both models. The RTX 5050 performs quite well in Call of Duty Black Ops 7 using the Extreme preset at 1080p. In the benchmark pass, the card achieves 91 FPS, making it 6% faster than the RTX B580. Performance is pretty similar using ultra quality versus quality upscaling. 1% lows are a little better on the B580, and then the Intel card is 8% ahead comparing quality versus quality. VRAM can exceed 8GB in this title on a 12GB card, but this doesn't seem to affect performance on 8GB models in the benchmark, and at least based on what I saw, the visual quality seems similar between the 5050 and B580. No noticeable texture issues. F125 runs really well on the ARC B580, demolishing the RTX 5050 when using the ultra high preset. Not only is this preset highly playable using ultra quality upscaling, but the Intel GPU is 48% faster than the 5050 using DLSS 4 quality. These settings used over 10GB of VRAM on the B580, so another problematic game for 8GB cards. If you want to try out ray tracing in Cyberpunk 2077, you might have thought using a GeForce GPU would be the way to go, but that's actually not the case in the entry level. The RTX 5050 is completely unplayable using the Ultra Ray Tracing preset even with DLSS 4 enabled, whereas the ARC B580 was somewhat playable. XeSS quality upscaling led to 57 FPS on average, which isn't the greatest experience at 1080p, but at the very least it allows you to explore what ray tracing provides. The B580 is 70% faster than the RTX 5050 in this example, using ultra quality versus quality upscaling, with the ultra ray tracing preset exceeding 8GB of VRAM. Hogwarts Legacy performance is very similar between these cards using the Ultra preset. The B580 is 4% slower if we compare upscaling at the same render resolution, but this is effectively a tie. However, VRAM can be a concern in this title as the game uses more than 9GB of VRAM on a 12GB card. As we've shown in other content, the way Hogwarts Legacy deals with not enough VRAM is to simply not show some textures. So while we may not see performance issues, the lack of VRAM can have a visual impact. And the B580 results show that Ultra is a realistic configuration for these cards at 1080p, as average performance is very good, so you'd probably want to use a B580 in this title. Using the very highest presets in Borderlands 4 is unrealistic on these models, as performance can be well below 60 FPS, so I've used high for this comparison. Here the ARC B580 is 17% faster using native rendering and 14% faster when comparing quality upscaling. This is another title that does not expose the ultra quality setting when XeSS is enabled, so the minimum level of upscaling is quality. These settings use about 9GB of VRAM, so this is another title where there are potential compromises on 8GB cards. Mafia The Old Country is interesting in that this game has issues on both GPUs. The Epic preset didn't load on the RTX 5050 and crashed to desktop each time, so I stuck to high for this comparison. And while the Epic preset does work on the B580, performance is very bad, with even high not working that well. The B580 can't hit 60 FPS on average with upscaling here, and the scaling provided through lower modes is really poor, making the Intel card 24% slower in this game. The high settings used less than 7GB of VRAM, so the 5050 is in the clear. Arc Raiders is a challenging game to test, so I've decided to benchmark the training ground area. This is a well-optimized title that uses under 6GB of VRAM with Epic settings, so 8GB cards can breathe easy. We also see superior performance on the RTX 5050 in general, coming in 8 to 10% faster than the B580. This is with ray tracing enabled, as the 5050 seems to run this configuration just fine at decent frame rates. Dying Light the Beast is a great game for the B580. Natively, the Intel card is 20% faster, and this extends to 27% when comparing quality versus quality upscaling. This is the third title we've seen so far where the ultra quality XeSS mode is not available. Also, in good news for the 5050, the game uses around 7GB of VRAM with high settings, so you shouldn't run into any VRAM related problems in this 2025 release. The Alters is another title that performs surprisingly poorly on the B580, offering 13% lower performance than the 5050 at native rendering using the Ultra preset. We also saw a 13% deficit comparing ultra quality versus quality upscaling, and an 8% deficit comparing quality versus quality. This is not a VRAM constrained game, requiring a little over 6GB of VRAM in our test area. Final game we're looking at is Battlefield 6. This is a significant win for the ARC B580, which massively outperforms the RTX 5050 in our bot match test using the Overkill preset. Now these settings may not be the optimal way to play, but the performance on the B580 is great at 1080p, delivering 82 FPS using ultra quality upscaling. In contrast, the RTX 5050 struggles to achieve 60 FPS. The B580 is 39% faster natively in this game, and 49% faster comparing ultra quality versus quality upscaling, so that's very significant. VRAM is a concern in Battlefield as well, with the Overkill preset using over 9GB of VRAM on the ARC B580. Now again, you could turn down the quality settings here, but this is optional on the B580 given the performance on offer, while it's basically mandatory on the 5050 to get a good experience at 1080p. Here's how the RTX 5050 and ARC B580 compare on average across 16 titles. I actually tested 19 games for this comparison, but 3 of them didn't offer XeSS ultra quality, which would have made it difficult to provide an average like this that also includes ultra quality. Omitting those 3 games only changes the other averages by 1 FPS or so, which is why I've opted to use a more accurate 16 game average here. And ultra quality is important given it uses the same render resolution as DLSS 4 quality. So here's what I found. Using native rendering, the B580 is 14% faster than the RTX 5050 in terms of average FPS at 1080p using reasonable high to ultra settings. With upscaling enabled at the same render resolution, so XeSS ultra quality versus DLSS 4 quality, the B580 is 11% faster on average. Comparing the same upscaling mode names, so quality versus quality, we see the B580 is 20% faster. So it depends on how you want to look at the data. But somewhere between 10 and 20% faster in average FPS is where the B580 lies. The Intel GPU does have a larger advantage in 1% lows because there were a couple of titles where frame time consistency is much worse on the RTX 5050. Natively, the B580 offers 23% better 1% lows, and this holds true looking at upscaling comparisons at the same render resolution. This is because there are a number of games that require more than 8GB of VRAM at 1080p, which causes performance issues on the RTX 5050. What's interesting about this comparison in particular is that the variance in performance between games is very high, much higher than we usually see comparing, say, GeForce and Radeon GPUs. In the best cases, like Battlefield 6, Ghost of Tsushima, or Cyberpunk 2077 with ray tracing enabled, the B580 can be 40% faster or more. But there's also a handful of games where the B580 is 5 to 10% slower, with Mafia The Old Country offering a particularly dreadful 24% slower average. So while the B580 is 14% faster on average across these games, each result is not consistently within a typical 10 to 20% range that you might expect from that average. This variance doesn't change much when upscaling is enabled, aside from a couple of results shifting around here and there. Upscaling at the same render resolution shows a very similar range of results, while comparing quality versus quality is more favorable to the Intel GPU as XeSS upscales from a lower render resolution for more performance. What I also found interesting is that the Unreal Engine results are consistently the worst on the ARC B580, especially when upscaling is enabled. Here in the quality versus quality chart, the 7 Unreal titles tested were in the bottom 10 results overall. Some of these titles did have VRAM issues on the RTX 5050 that don't show up in this chart, but what this tells me is that if Nvidia's entry-level GPUs like the RTX 5050 did have enough VRAM, they'd probably have a notable advantage in the world's most popular game engine. That's a bit concerning for Intel given how widespread Unreal Engine is, especially because outside of that, in other engines, the ARC B580 can be much faster. At the end of the day, what we're looking at here with the GeForce RTX 5050 and ARC B580 are 2 compromise products. I really wish this wasn't the case at $250 US because there was a time about a decade ago where this price range offered very solid graphics card options. But the world is different now and you can no longer get a reliable, consistent GPU on a budget. Let's talk about the strengths of each product. The Intel Arc B580 is generally the faster GPU at 1080p. It's not always faster, but it is faster on average, and in the best cases, it's significantly faster than the RTX 5050. We've also seen in previous testing that the B580 scales quite well at higher resolutions like 1440p, so I would expect this margin to increase if we retested all these game configurations at 1440p. The big advantage to the B580 is clearly its 12GB of VRAM. Most of the games tested today use more than 8GB of VRAM at 1080p using ultra settings. In fact, just 6 of the 19 didn't. A couple of titles only slightly exceed 8GB, so the RTX 5050 can to some degree get away with it. Other games are using 9 to 10GB and either have performance or visual compromises on the 8GB RTX 5050. This isn't something that can be DLSS'd away either. Most games still exceed 8GB using Ultra, even with upscaling enabled. What this means in real-world terms is that the ARC B580 is more likely to deliver a consistent gaming experience in the many configurations today that now require more than 8GB of VRAM. Games are continuing to increase their VRAM requirements even for 1080p gaming, so 12GB is much more usable and future-proof. It also enables the B580 to run games at higher quality settings than the 5050. There are quite a number of titles where ultra settings deliver playable frame rates on the B580 at 1080p, whereas on the RTX 5050, you're basically forced to turn settings down to keep the game inside the 8GB VRAM limit. Now, some might say that given the overall performance of the B580, you'd probably be turning settings down from ultra to high or medium on that card as well. But the way I see it is that you have options on the B580. You can choose ultra at lower frame rates or medium at higher frame rates. On the RTX 5050, you don't have a choice. In many titles today, it's a medium settings card only at 1080p. The RTX 5050 does have some strengths though. It has more mature drivers with NVIDIA building on decades of game support. If you can get a game running inside 8GB of VRAM, the 5050 is more likely to deliver a playable, consistent experience with dialed down settings often being viable. The A.L.K.E.R B580 on the other hand has some big wins where games run super well, much faster than the 5050, and then some notable issues like Spider-Man 2 and Mafia The Old Country, where the ARC card really struggles even if you turn down the settings. Intel's drivers have come a long way, so game-breaking crashes and graphical glitches aren't too much of a concern in modern titles these days, but there are still some games that just don't play nicely with the Intel Battlemage architecture. The RTX 5050 also offers better upscaling. DLSS 4 simply looks better than XeSS at 1080p, and while the XeSS XMX version you get with Intel GPUs is still usable, I pretty much universally prefer how DLSS 4 looks. This creates a weird situation, where the A.L.K.E.R B580 is more likely to play games at higher visual quality settings, like say Ultra, but the RTX 5050 will deliver better upscaled visual quality on lower settings. NVIDIA also offers much better DLSS game support than Intel with XeSS. To Intel's credit, XeSS game support is actually pretty good given their very low GPU market share, with many modern titles now including support. But DLSS is pretty much universal these days and is supported in the vast majority of games, many with DLSS 4 and the rest with still decent DLSS 2 or 3. XeSS isn't as widely supported as even AMD's FSR 4 in 2025 releases, and the bad news is that when a game doesn't support XeSS, the most common fallback upscaling option for an Intel GPU is FSR 3 or 2.2, which is very bad at 1080p. The smaller range of XeSS games is why this video hasn't benchmarked as many titles as our previous DLSS versus FSR videos. A couple of big releases from this year, like Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, don't officially offer XeSS at all. All things considered, for most people, I would recommend the Intel Arc B580. Getting DLSS 4 support on GeForce is nice, but there are too many games now where 8GB of VRAM leads to a compromised experience, even at 1080p with upscaling. For gamers that mostly play newer AAA titles and enjoy playing with ultra settings, more than 8GB is a must, so the B580 with 12GB is best equipped for newer games at higher settings while still offering a playable experience. Intel's driver development is also mostly focused on newer games, so from that side of things, Arc these days is generally reliable in the latest titles, with the occasional exception. The RTX 5050 is not a good choice at $250 US due to its limited VRAM and also poor cost per frame value relative to other models like the RTX 5060. From that standpoint, it really should be cheaper, but it might make sense if you mostly play older games that will fit within the 8GB VRAM buffer and just want the cheapest current generation model you can get. I'm not saying that's a great reason, but driver support for older titles and better upscaling is a viable reason to get the 5050 and is the only real reason I can think of. Ultimately though, the RTX 5050 could have been a viable option and maybe the go-to GPU in the entry level if it had 12GB of VRAM and if it was a little bit cheaper. As things stand, the A.L.K.E.R B580 is the best choice for most people, and if you are going to buy a new entry-level GPU, would recommend doing so soon before VRAM price increases throw everything out of whack. So anyway, that's it for this one. If you do appreciate our independent testing and analysis right here at Hardware Unboxed, please consider subscribing to the channel, giving this video a like, and also signing up to our Patreon page. Links to that are in the description below. If you sign up, you get access to some pretty cool benefits. We've got our monthly live streams, BTS content, Discord chat, plenty of good stuff. So thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.